everyone. Welcome to Crossing Paths, and it is as a part of Cannes Festival 2021. I'm Anting, the artistic director of Chinese Arts Now. Cannes, Chinese Arts Now, we produce and present the very best contemporary British Chinese arts. Today, the event is as a part of our Stay Connected strand at Cannes Festival. Stay Connected is a new strand of Cannes Festival, where we invite all artists involved in Cannes Festival's 2019 and 2020 to come back and share their works. We are very happy that we have three amazing composers to share their work today, and a great musician Reylon is going to host the event. Before I hand it over to Reylon, I'd like to introduce their involvement at Cannes Festivals before. We commissioned Alex Ho for our ping pong concert, which was as a part of South Bank Center's Soundstage Festival in 2019. And we also presented a Tangram concert by Alex Ho and Reylon Yount at LSO St. Luke's as a part of Cannes Festival 2019. It is very lovely to see how far Tangram has been gone now after that concert, where Tangram was launched. I'll leave Alex and Reylon to let you know more about Tangram. Raymond Yiu is the other brilliant composer we commissioned for the ping pong concert. With Keting Sun, we commissioned her for a new score for a Chinese string quartet and a European string quartet by LSO. It's very exciting to gather all of them today, and I can't wait to hear their music and the conversation. Now I'd like to hand it over to the host today, Reylon.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Anting, for that introduction. Welcome to Crossing Paths. Today we're bringing to you live three amazing artists, two digital premieres, all woven together into one evocative conversation. So I hope you're excited. I know that I am. My name is Reylon Yount, and I'm a Chinese-American yangqin player based here in London, and I'm the co-founder of Tangram alongside Alex Ho. Tangram is an artist collective exploring the richness and multiplicity of Chinese diasporic experience through music. And as Anting mentioned, we actually launched as part of the Chinese Arts Now Festival back in 2019. So we're always delighted to have the opportunity to work in partnership with Cannes again. Today, we're going to hear from three wonderful composers who have all been involved in Tangram in some way. I'm going to begin by introducing the artists and asking them an opening question, and then we're going to focus on each artist one by one and listen to their music as we go along. So if you have any questions or comments for the artists, feel free to add those into the live chat, and we'll feed those into the conversation the best we can. Sean, if you want to bring in Raymond, Rocky, and Alex, so people can see their faces while I'm introducing them. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
It's so nice to be here with all of you. You know, I should say we all know each other on a personal level and an artistic level, but it's rare to have this chance to sit down and go in depth and ask questions about each other's creative practices. So I'm really excited for this special opportunity to talk to you all. So by way of introduction, Raymond Yiu is a Hong Kong-born, London-based composer, jazz pianist, and the winner of a BAFTA British Composer Award in 2010 and a multi-time nominee. He's worked with ensembles and artists including Lucas Foss, BBC Philharmonic, BBC Singers, Chroma, Ensemble 1010, and really just made his mark here in London and in the UK contemporary music scene. Keting, who also goes by Rocky, is a London-based Chinese composer and artist currently studying her PhD in composition at the Royal Academy of Music. Her recent works focus on performing arts and instrumental sound exploration, combining Eastern cultural, spiritual, and philosophical elements. In recent years, she received commissions from the London Symphony Orchestra, the London Philharmonic Orchestra, BBC Singers, the Riot Ensemble, the Silk Road Ensemble, Tangram. I could go on. And finally, last but not least, Alex Ho, co-founder of Tangram with me, is a British Chinese composer Based in London. Okay, everyone's based in London. Winner of the George Butterworth Award 2020, and he's composed for London Symphony Orchestra, Shanghai Philharmonic Orchestra, Royal Opera House, National Opera Studio. Again, I could go on. So we have three brilliant composers here, but I think what's really special is that all three of you have woven your own unique path between Chinese and Western cultures as people and as artists. And our aim today as a group is to get a peek behind the score, to find out a bit more about the synergies and the divergences between these creative paths that you've walked, and understand more deeply the process that goes into creating new music. A lot of people who've been listening may have heard your music before or seen contemporary music performed, but maybe haven't had the chance to hear from composers themselves about what that process is like. So really excited for you to share that with us. Okay, so I'm going to kick us off with an opening question for all three of you. And that question is, how do your thoughts and feelings about identity influence the way you make music today? And I think I'll start out with Raymond.
It's funny that is possibly a question I didn't really ask myself for years. I think when I first started, I was just interested in just to write music. But I think as I get older and I compose more, I was being more aware of my place in as a Chinese who was born in Hong Kong and lived here. So I kind of had my situation of being in the kind of ethnic majority turn into an ethnic minority, and then suddenly that become quite occurred, very interesting conversation with myself, and to kind of that became a very interesting engine to kind of drive the way I think about my work, really.
That's beautiful. I love that metaphor of the engine, which reminds me of the piece that we're going to hear. How about Rocky? Do you want to share with us the connection between identity and music making for you?
Yeah, I was born and grew up in a city called Xi'an in China. I lived there for about 18 years before I moved to Shanghai, and then moved to London. And Xi'an is probably one of the most ancient cities there in the world, and I was so influenced by the poetries, the calligraphies, the whole Chinese cultural elements, but without knowing that, until I moved to London, I gradually realized that's something within my blood, and that's something that I carried without being conscious. So that's what why I got into Eastern philosophy, because I needed to find answers for why and how I do things. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rocky. And Alex, how about you? Identity, music making, connections.
Yeah, thank you for the introductions. Firstly, it's really great to be here with you all. Yeah, so I guess in terms of my background, so I'm a British-born Chinese. I was born and raised in London, and I'm still in London, so haven't moved nearly as far as all three of you, I guess, actually. But having said that, I think there are definitely resonances with what Raymond and Rocky have said in that kind of search for identity and kind of trying to locate ourselves and our Chinese-ness in the UK and what it means to be, I don't know, like a minority, I guess. And so for me, how that often translates into my compositional process is by thinking about the framework of contemporary classical music. So for me, I'm interested in ways that we can rethink what the classical music space means and what it means to be a person of color in that classical music space. So that might manifest itself as rethinking what the relationship is between the performer and the audience. It might be rethinking what the relationship is between the composer and the performer. Those kind of things are kind of structures I think I'm interested in reevaluating.
Fabulous. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and I think what we've found through Tangram is that these are very fresh conversations. I think we all have questions related to our identity, the cultural context we're working in, the different influences from different parts of the world. And music gives us this kind of alternative language to go beyond maybe the surface level of the rhetoric or the labels we may usually use to define identity and get at something a little bit deeper. Okay, thank you all. I'd like to now turn our focus to Raymond and your story before we hear a little bit of your music. So Raymond, you mentioned this shift coming from Hong Kong to London, and to shifting from being in the ethnic majority to the ethnic minority. Can you tell us a bit more about your personal journey growing up in Hong Kong and moving to the UK, and how this influenced your process as an artist and your musical interests?
Sure. I think growing up in Hong Kong, I think one thing is kind of given is that music wasn't really kind of upfront in the kind of in the foreground. So my upbringing is pretty much very kind of science focused. Therefore, my first degree was actually doing engineering, and I didn't really study music until I decided I wanted to do it full time at the age of like 36, and I did it as a PhD. So my musical, the music I used to listen to a lot when I was in Hong Kong was Cantonese pop, as well as a lot of pop music from the UK and the US. And then only I discovered when after I came here, I discovered a lot of the Cantonese pop that I used to know and loved were actually cover versions of the UK and US pop music. And then I also listened to classical music when I was in Hong Kong, but they mostly the kind of the Baroque, the classical, the Romantic period kind of music. And then, strangely enough, when I was in Hong Kong, we weren't really exposed to traditional Chinese music. So, for example, when we were kids, we were encouraged to learn instrument, but mostly piano, violin, or guitar. But we weren't given the opportunity to learn erhu and pipa, for example, which kind of quite strange because as a result, I didn't really have a very kind of close relationship with traditional Chinese music. Only after I lived in UK for a little bit, and then I start working with instrumentalists of Chinese instruments, that I slowly discover about Chinese music, the techniques and the philosophy behind it, which is kind of it's very strange that if you live in the country, which the music it should be more like a common thing. And I thought try not to be something that you don't really know much about until you're actually in a place out far away from home, which I find it quite unusual.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about Mao Yu, which is this piece that you were commissioned to compose for the Silk String Quartet, which is a traditional Chinese ensemble here in London, and also with Lang Lang, who's one of the most famous Chinese pianists. And having had the opportunity to play this piece, it was so interesting, because it did feel like, your voice, your style, there was a contrast with the music I'd played before with on Yangqin and these ensembles. And it's like, it's a useful reminder to remember that these traditions, these instruments, and these composers are not a monolith, right? We're all learning and rediscovering what Chinese music is, and also recreating what it is. Can you speak a little bit about what that experience was like when you worked with Chinese music, Chinese instruments for the first time?
It was, I think it's almost like learning to drive or to do something that you never done before, and you approach an instrument with complete blank page, and then I just discuss with the players in the ensemble just to learn the kind of basic the physicality of the instrument, what can or cannot do on the instrument, and then just listen to the repertoire of each of the instrument, just kind of get it into your system, and to kind of get familiar with them before you try to use them. I think it's just like using Western instrument. You need to understand the timbre and the possibility of the instrument, and then you use your imagination to kind of find out how they will work together as an ensemble. But I think writing Mao Mao Yu was quite a turning point for me, because it was pretty much about the time that when I was in a kind of almost like a crisis, because up to that point my music was pretty random. I tend to just pick ideas and subject matter randomly, and then I over time I realized that wasn't the way to go forward. And then, but before that, I did two pieces, which is my a piece called Night Shanghai, and my first opera, the original Chinese Conjurer, and both of which I was kind of interested in Chinese pop music or pop music in China in the mid 20th century onward. And I kind of linked back into my love for Cantonese pop. I asked myself, where does that come from? Where does Cantonese pop come from? And it can't just all be secondhand American and UK pop music. So I did a lot of research, and I traced the history back to the Chinese pop music. Shidai in the 1920s, when and Parfy, the record company, set up a branch in Shanghai, and they start doing gramophone records. They engage Chinese musicians to work with a lot of black musicians at the time. Because of the Depression, a lot of black musicians couldn't get work at home, so they moved to Shanghai. So strangely enough, from the 20s onward, there was a lot of dance band and dance hall there, and there was a lot of jazz musicians active there. So that genre of music kind of gave me a kind of new source of ideas and inspiration. And then I think that was quite an important step for me, really.
That's so wonderful. I didn't know that about that history in the 1920s in Shanghai. But I did feel like I got to know some aspect of Cantonese pop a bit better by playing that piece, and hearing you speak about it. It's so beautiful when music can kind of create that portal for us to connect with lost histories or forgotten histories, or ones that just are not heard as much. Speaking of that, of uncovering lost histories through music, can you tell us a bit about this piece we're going to hear now, Corner of a Foreign Field, and where the inspiration came from?
Corner of a Foreign Field, I think, is a piece that kind of in my mind for some time. I read an article in The Guardians about the Chinese Labour Corps during the First World War, they were active between 1918 and 1920, of 140,000 Chinese person being signed up by the British and the French government to do dirty work, to do kind of in the background kind of work to help with the war effort. But they were eventually being disbanded and sent back to China and completely forgotten in history. So has been for years, there was no commemoration or mention of them at all. So I knew about the story for ages, and I kind of wanted to do something about it. And then about the same time, I think I saw the play, a really good play by the London-based playwright Daniel York, called Forgotten, and which is about the Chinese Labour Corps as well. So that kind of really gave me more impetus to decide to do this. And then you guys came along and with a commission said that you want me to write a piece. And then I just thought that interesting ensemble that you have in Tangram will work really well with the subject matter.
Well, it was an honor for us to commission it and bring this sonic monument to life. Okay, let's listen to an excerpt of Corner of a Foreign Field. Sean? Wow, so great to hear it again. Just want to give a quick shout out to Angela Wynok Hui, Jessica Zhu on piano, Angela's on percussion, Yishan Chen is on flute. And also mention that this piece was nominated, it was shortlisted for a RPS Composition Award last year too. I'd love to open it up to questions from Alex, Rocky, and also the audience. If you're listening, if you have questions, please add them to the live chat.
Yeah, I guess maybe I can start. That was, yeah, it was emotional to watch that back because it just feels like such a different lifetime when we premiered that piece, like I guess a year ago now. But I remember the performance itself being quite emotional as well, actually, because we were performing it, I think, in celebration of Lunar New Year at LSO St. Luke's, and we were giving a pre-concert talk where we were going to introduce each of the pieces, and wonderful composer Jasmine Kent Rodgman also was writing a piece for us that we premiered. And so, Raymond, I think for some reason you weren't quite able to make it, so I ended up talking about Corner of a Foreign Field, and just talking about the subject matter and that deep level of embarrassment on behalf of the UK, and sadness and tragedy on behalf of those Chinese Labour Corps who weren't acknowledged for so many years, I found that a really heavy and emotional thing to do. And obviously in the piece itself, that translates really strikingly in the amount of kind of silence and how that's worked in towards the end. It's just a very kind of grief-stricken piece. And so I guess my question to you was like, did you find the writing process itself emotional?
I think it was, but it wasn't as intense as it could have been because the piece has been brewing in my head for so long. So I just kind of have a rough idea how to translate that, because I don't want to make a monument which is kind of over the top. I want to kind of quite stark. I mean, the movement that you just heard is the exception. Is the one that kind of feels quite joyous. Actually, it's not. It's kind of much more mechanical. I was kind of trying to depict the kind of journey they have on those kind of cramped environment on the boat. And then in that movement, there was a quotation of the English and the French national anthem in there, but it's so kind of hidden. It's almost like a parody almost, but in a way that I think emotional, yes, but I don't want to kind of wear the emotion on the sleeve of the piece itself. I want the piece to become much slightly detached. So I just want the audience kind of hear what they heard, and then, and more importantly, is to go away and find out more about these people who hasn't been acknowledged for so many years. And I think it's in a way that it's almost like a reflection of the Chinese race, because I think that we don't tend to kind of make a lot of noise, I think, in a way. So therefore, that a lot of time that in history that we tend to sideline, I think. So I
totally get that. think just to respond quickly, it was really good to see you bring up that subject, because I think in Western classical music, when we think of Chinese influenced pieces, we think of some kind of celebration and that kind of joy, which I think there definitely should be room for, and it is lovely to see pieces like that. But on the other hand, I think a piece like Corner of the Foreign Field that does acknowledge that deep colonial structure, those kind of pieces are so important. And as you say, to raise awareness of that kind of issue, like I wasn't even aware of that until you brought the piece to us, and so that was, even on just a micro level, a really important thing for me personally as well.
I mean, the only thing that I thought is quite weird is that I keep forgetting that it was written for the concert for the Chinese New Year. I just wasn't quite sure how such a kind of slightly morbid piece will actually work in that context. But I'm glad people appreciate that, and it really did make an impact, which is the purpose of the piece, writing the piece, really.
Yes, that absolutely did make an impact. Rocky, did you have any questions for Raymond about the piece, or just generally about his practice?
Yeah, that was great piece, Raymond. It was a shame I wasn't able to come at the time.
Don't worry, I wasn't.
Oh, really? Great performance, guys. That was really, really good. I guess my question is probably regarding the musical element. That there are two kind of questions. First one being, as you said, like being, when you first written for Chinese instruments, and even until now, like having like kind of a traditional Chinese instrument yangqin, and together with very like the classical Western instruments combination. And does like the traditional folk music element kind of influence you when you compose, or dominant that harmony, or let's say tonal language, or
Sometimes I think as I writing more, I think at the moment I think in quite more like a modal way of thinking. The movement, you just heard the fast movement, is actually based on a very mechanical way of rotating pentatonic scale. So in every that movement is actually based on all 12 modes of the pentatonic scale move very, very quickly. Sometimes there will be only one pentatonic mode active. Sometimes there'll be like 3 or 4. So the music can become very pentatonic or quite chromatic, depends on how many modes I allow them to move. So that was actually inspired by Stephen Jones' book on Chinese folk music. So he was talking about how Chinese music was generally the basic way of modulation.
Right.
But a lot of the other outer movement is more have like multiple mode kind of overlapping. So that creates a slightly, or sometimes kind of pentatonic, sometimes whole tone, sometimes weird kind of odd tonal element. But it's quite modal the way it was done.
Right.
Raymond, you're kind of blowing my mind here, because I grew up studying Chinese music, and the music that I played looked like this. It's in Chinese notation. It's numbers, and at the top it tells you what the key is. And so the way I think musically is very modal. Like I think in terms of the scale degrees, so do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti instead of C sharp, A sharp, G flat. And that's been a big challenge when I play a lot of Western pieces. But I remember when I was practicing your piece and I was looking at the score and I was like, oh my gosh, I was so overwhelmed. It's like this fast section. I was really scared. But then as I was digging into it, I saw, oh, it's the same pattern, but just it shifts up. And so it's the same shape. And so I could detect that modal quality, and that made it so much more comfortable for me to learn. But I never kind of made that connection that was actually like intentional on your part. And it's like connected to actually the music culture that I grew up learning in. So gratitude for
You're
that.
not something new today, but I think
Yeah.
I also come from the way, because I'm a jazz pianist, so I memorize all the song by translating all the tune into sofa name. So therefore, they enable me to transpose very quickly. So my musical thinking is I don't. That's why sight reading is quite difficult for me, because I always think in kind of like a mode. So once I remember the song, you tell me if someone asks me to write to play a song, and I'll ask what key, so I can instantly just play it, because I remember the melody by the way you remember Chinese melody, really.
Wow, gorgeous. Discovering something new every day.
Thank you for playing.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna move us along so that we can make sure we hear all the pieces. Thank you so much, Raymond, for sharing
Thank you.
all those insights. So now I'd love to turn our attention to Rocky and your story. So Rocky, you're doing a PhD right now, and its focus is on Eastern spirituality and philosophies and their sonic manifestations. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you came to decide on this research topic and where this line of questioning has been taking you recently?
Yeah. Yeah, as I said earlier, that I was living in a kind of one of the most ancient city, and I was so unconsciously influenced by so many cultural aspects that I didn't really, I was kind of taken for granted until I moved to London and seeing things and asking things, and just the differences that I experience in the daily life was, or I could say, something new, or something that was out of my kind of my comfort zone. And then at that time, I was struggling emotionally and mentally a little bit. So I started to practice yoga and meditation, and I was reading into a lot of literatures about Buddhism. And that's where really it got me into. My first piece was inspired by the Four Noble Truths from Buddhism. And that piece was truly really like the first step into this like a spirituality inspired compositions. And I felt truly for the first time I felt close to my compositions, because when I was in Shanghai, all I was learning was Western music theories and compositional theories and harmonies, etc., etc. And I was just trying so hard to just write contemporary music in a way that's Western contemporary music, without really knowing what I was doing. It was purely just, I could say, maybe technical in the way. So ever since I felt really intimate with Eastern philosophy, I felt like that is really my way into my composition process, and the way into how I understand music, and how I could learn from these philosophies, really.
It's really inspiring, and I have to say, whenever I witness your pieces or when I'm playing in them, I do feel that sort of mindfulness translating in a way that I feel that one can only really experience without words. I'm curious for you today, whenever you're beginning to write a new piece, what's that process? How do you listen to the inspiration and compose the first note? Can you just share a little insight into how that process goes?
Yeah, so as mindful as it sounds, like how things inspire me from this school of thoughts, my compositional process is pretty kind of straightforward. I would always like come with ideas of one notion of Eastern philosophy and then start with that. So these days, most of my piece, I actually start with a title. What is this piece? I would like to one notion of Eastern philosophy I would like to use as almost like a tool for me to build a structure, build texture within instruments, and most importantly, the physicality within this notions of Eastern philosophy, because most of the time, Eastern philosophy comes with motion practice and a visualizations. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, it's, for example, I wrote a piece that's based on one notion of Zen Buddhism, which is just a circular stroke, and that circular stroke became the most important, the most essential element within the compositional process and the collaborative process as well. Yeah, so at the beginning of writing the piece, this is always something that I'm looking for and settling in my mind and really studying what it's about. And I guess by writing a piece, I'm learning what is the meaning behind that philosophy.
Wow, thank you. It's so profound. And I want to point out two things that you mentioned, which I think resonate with my understanding of Chinese music from my experience as a yangqin player, which is one, this visual element that you mentioned. It really makes a lot of sense to me because when I was growing up learning in a Chinese music tradition, there was a lot of emphasis on visual performance and the way the instrument looks, the way your gestures are. Whereas whenever I was learning in slightly more Western context, sometimes that was actually pared back, and people were saying, don't think as much about the visual, just the sonic. And then the other point is this, the title, because I think something we notice in a lot of Western classical music, it's different. Obviously, this is kind of a generalization, but a lot of classical pieces, there's a kind of purity or resistance to having an evocative title. Opus 3, number 5, it's like, oh, you don't want to put an image in people's heads of what it means. But in Chinese music, we're very evocative with our titles. Spring arrives on the Qing River, tall mountains and flowing water. So that as a starting point, an image as a starting point, or a notion as a starting point, and then music as something that adds dimension and deepens an understanding of that notion. It's just an alternative way, I think, to think about music expression and that relationship between music and meaning. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, could you tell us a bit about this piece that we're going to hear, Ma, and maybe the title and just the inspiration behind it?
Yes, so this piece that you're going to hear is called Ma, and it was composed in collaboration with guitarist Fabrizio Matos. And the main origin of this collaboration was our shared interest for emptiness, as a term that's kind of constantly discussed as the as the absence of inherent existence in many Eastern philosophies. But in Western culture, it refers to a space or a feeling or a condition. And ma, this word in Japanese, refers to this perception of space, a gap or an interval, and that has been described as the silence between the notes which make music. So that was kind of the inspiration we drew from the philosophy. But in the process of like composing, this philosophical idea of Ma has been conceptualized first into music, in order to manifest this silence in between. While the music was like mainly focused on, the guitar's timbre, the reverberation, and the dynamic, and the pitch range of the instruments. And it's also this idea is also kind of visualized physically, within the guitarist, minimizing his movements between sounds. And I often ask him to freeze if possible. So you will see that.
Wonderful. Thanks for that introduction. So let's listen to Ma, and I'll just mention this is the world premiere of this version of the piece. Wow.
Thank you. I should mention that this is an excerpt of the piece. The piece is actually much longer, and because of the time limit we have today, but I will publish the piece on my YouTube channel for you to check out.
Thank you. Even just an excerpt, and in this audiovisual medium, I felt very moved by that.
Thank you.
Responses, questions from our artists and from our audience?
I've got a very interesting question. I just love the silence in between this burst of sound. Are they time, or you just leave them to the performer?
It's not timed. Yeah. It's very. It's well. First version of this piece was written in 3 no bar lines on the score, and this version of the piece we actually cut the score into just small bits of the notes, so the gaps in between the sound actually left a blank on the page as well. So the score is very much like fragmented looking, but the length of the rests are decided by the guitarist, and yeah.
I think personally, I find that silence is one of the hardest things to deal with. In Corner of a Foreign Field, the things that took me longest is actually to work out the silence bit between, especially in the movement of the piano alone. Those silence are so time consuming. I think sometimes I compose with a stopwatch. I just sit there and stopwatch and count the second and hear the silence in my head and then work out how long it should be and kind of dictate this is how long it should be. But I'm just thinking, whether you want to have control over the silence at all.
Yeah. I guess it was like, because it was very kind of a collaborative one-on-one process with Fabrizio, and it was all very organically kind of the decisions were made between us. So I wasn't being at all specific with that. It was really like very much his experience of filling that gap as well. And I felt like for performance, especially for us composers, it's sometimes really tricky knowing or feeling the real silence or the rests, because on the score it looks just, it's a rest, but in the performance people actually can feel it. And I think it's so important as notes put in on the score. And it's really challenging, and I felt like there's so much else I could have done with the silence as well. But I think that's something we're all, there's always something that we want to improve and just down the line.
Yeah, I'm reeling from that. The video. I mean, the visuals itself was so beautiful, and so just like appropriate, obviously, for the point of the piece, and everything about the way it was shot and directed and obviously played is so. I feel so calm. I haven't felt this calm in weeks, months maybe. And I'm also glad that you didn't do the stopwatch thing. There's something like weirdly disruptive about that image of you with a stopwatch versus what we just saw. And I can see Derry in the comments also does the same thing with the stopwatch, so that's funny to hear. If I can like tease out a question whilst I'm still reading from that performance, I think I'm interested in like your broader practice, Rocky. And so obviously this one, you said it was quite a kind of close collaboration with Fabrizio, who has a shared interest in emptiness and that kind of thing. And so I guess my question is like more broadly, when you are working with performers who don't necessarily have the same exactly the same cultural interests or cultural backgrounds, like how important is it for you that you communicate those sometimes very specific cultural elements to them versus just letting the music speak for itself? Because I guess a piece like that, to me, it was extremely clear and effective, and I can imagine that if you just gave the score to someone, they would probably get a lot from it as it was. But then perhaps with other pieces, do you feel that you need to communicate or want to communicate specific cultural elements to people who are less versed than you in those areas?
Yeah, I think my answer is mostly yes. And I think in the ideal world, I would like the piece to kind of speak for itself. But sometimes new contemporary music doesn't do that very well. And I think what I learned from Eastern philosophy is it sounds very kind of vague, ambiguous sometimes, but if it comes down to one notion or just one small element from the bigger picture, I think we all experience it somehow in our daily life. So it's actually not hard for me to explain or like tell people how these philosophy, what the actual meanings of the philosophy, or just the simply explanations of it. And I think most of the musicians I work with who can actually grasp it very easily and get that into the performance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess there's an element where on a broader level, that idea of kind of cross-cultural exchange, which I think to some degree is important to all of us here, I think to a lot of degrees, I guess. And so particularly something which I've found has been particularly nice is when you're, collaborating with performers and they have slightly different experiences of whatever you're talking about, and to generate that conversation, I guess, and that collaborative spirit. And I'm just recalling some of your previous pieces, Rocky, like the one that you wrote for Tangram and the one that you wrote for the London Symphony Orchestra. Those kind of ideas were so striking, and I just remember like the musicians, certainly as Tangram, when we were performing your new piece, that we could really I don't know, just like feel the depth. You can see I'm still reading from your performance because I can't speak properly at all right now, but I could really feel the spirit of the piece really, really well. And then when you came in and spoke about it, that only like enhanced it more, which was brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
I love that you use the word spirit. Just feeding in some of the feedback we're getting from the live chat. Yishuai Zhang mentioned the way he plays guitar reminds me of how guzheng is played. Oh, there it is. And a sudden cluster of sounds. Nice piece. For me, guqin is what came to mind. So guqin being the most ancient kind of native instrument from China, and it being an instrument that scholars would play as an act of self-cultivation, as an act of almost tuning the soul with the surroundings. Oh, there you go, a guide. And yeah, really enjoyed that, and that kind of spaciousness, those clusters do evoke that kind of style. And then Derry's asked this question, which I think we've kind of actually covered some of it, but if anyone wants to comment on this, Derry would love to know if and how your music is shaped by Chinese culture, even when the title or the piece is not explicitly about that subject. Does any of you three want to comment on that?
I guess I can have a go. That's a really good question, and I think the really nice thing about composition, obviously I know Derry's a very, very good composer as well, so I'm sure you know this too. But there are so many different ways that you can do that you can find inspiration, and then how that inspiration can manifest itself in a piece. You know, I mean, I think Rocky's already spoken about the form and the structure and how that can be informed by a certain idea or by a certain notion. And I guess something that I've been interested in the past has been looking at ways in which Chinese culture can reimagine like standard performance practice of Western classical music. So one quick example might be a piece that I wrote for a traditional Chinese string quartet, and I was thinking about the ways in which, firstly, like Chinese musicians are really incredible improvisers, and within that, then the role of the score, which in Western classical music is often seen as the kind of apotheosis of what the music work is, that is much less important in Chinese music, and I understand like a lot of other musics as well. And so in that piece, I was writing a piece to explore that by having the string quartet use a score which I had written notes on to play, and then gradually throughout the piece, the players were instructed to use the physical paper of the score and take it from the stand and use that to play their instruments, as a way of thinking about the score and making music, and rethinking that whole relationship as inspired by Chinese music. So I guess that's like, yeah, maybe one example of the richness that is out there and the ways in which cultural elements can manifest in music, which is so exciting.
It's so exciting. And actually, first, I'm just going to ask Alex if you want to just refresh now. We've gotten a request to just optimize your video, and I'll speak a little bit ahead of our chat. I think part of what's so exciting is, in some ways, it's the not knowing what these influences are or what's happening underneath, and composing or performing can become this process of discovery of new things, new elements. So thank you, Derry, for that question. Okay, let's turn our attention now to Alex. And as we do this, I want to acknowledge that we've got about 20 minutes left, 25 minutes left in the event. And if anyone has screen fatigue, I invite you to look away from the screen and just listen. We'll be here, and we want you to stay to the end because we've got another world premiere and more to talk about. So thank you everyone again for being with us today. Now, Alex, so we've heard a little bit about that piece, and I want to kind of back things up just a bit and talk about your creative practice. So, you and I met in the fall of 2017, and we had tea, and you were one of the few British people that I knew when I came here to London. And in that first conversation, we discovered our shared interest for exploring Chinese diasporic identity through music, but from two very different angles. You as a British Chinese composer with parents from Hong Kong, who was completely Western classically trained, and me as a Chinese American yangqin player. And I want to know if you can tell us about how this creative exploration of diasporic identity has evolved over the last 3 years.
That is a good question. Yeah, I mean, it evolved. Yeah, I think it evolved quite a bit, I guess. Not necessarily in the music that I write, but definitely in my thinking of why I write music. That being, I think when we met, Reylon, I was kind of at the very start of my journey, not to say that I'm anywhere near the end now, but at the start of my journey, thinking about Chinese identity and what it meant to be writing music as a British-born Chinese with parents from Hong Kong. And in that sense, the first pieces that I was writing was a kind of exploration for myself. I was thinking about what are my experiences of Chinese culture, what kind of things do I want to say as an individual in my music. And I think that's since evolved into a more communal endeavor. And so I guess right now I'm interested in the ways in which my music is a platform to bring together music practitioners, music lovers, audiences, and what it means to build a community together in that space of performance. And so I guess in that sense, I'm often thinking about ways in which a piece can not just tell my story, but also tell the story of whoever is performing it, or how it can bring in the audience's experience or participation at that. And I think that probably links into this piece that we're about to show here, which is like the whole idea was very much inspired by a conversation I had with a brilliant Irish Hong Kong pianist, Aidan Chan, who's studying at the Royal College of Music. And so that kind of process, I think, is becoming more and more common for me, where my pieces are so inspired by conversations with other people, by experiences I've had with other people, and hopefully trying to see my music as a kind of outward facing, but also very much a collaborative piece.
Thank you. And I'm excited to hear more about Knuckleduster, this piece that we're going to see. But before we do, I just want to also draw out what you've been talking about towards the beginning about change in the classical music industry. You know, we're finding ourselves in a year where Asian communities have faced a lot of racism in the world, and also people have woken up to, I think, racism and biases and just like monolithic reductive perceptions of Asian communities within the arts ecosystem itself. And I'd love to know if you're willing to share any specific experiences or observations about the change that you would like to see in the classical music industry.
Yeah, that's a really good and important question, because I think, yeah, the optimistic thing, I think, from the last 12 months, despite all of the tragedies in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of coronavirus, all of these things, hate towards Asian Americans, it does sound like the arts industry is listening at last. And actually, I was in a really inspiring event this morning, actually hosted by British Council and HCMF, where they were bringing together artists from all over the world to talk about the art scene. And something which came up was the idea that the classical music scene was, for some people, it felt like the classical music scene was behind other kind of genres of music in terms of diversity, in terms of understanding the need to provide equal opportunities, in terms of understanding the historical inequalities within it. And so those conversations, I think, are so important. And I guess at this point, for me, I think we're still at that kind of fledgling stage where we need to continue these conversations. And I want to see these conversations had between artists and audiences, between artists, between composers and performers, that kind of thing. And I think for me, like I think maybe just one example, hopefully without just throwing anything or anyone under the bus, is I think in the choral world, where you have a lot of tendencies, I guess, for white, often quite middle class singers to sing spirituals. That's something which I have experienced, and I think I can't share any of the feelings, which is where spirituals came from. And yet there are so many times when performances have happened in the past where there is no context given. There are no conversations about how spirituals came about, what they are for, the kind of cultural and colonial context they come from. But I think that's changing. And those kind of conversations,
like African American roots.
Exactly. exactly, and the links, I guess, to transatlantic slavery and that kind of thing, and talking about the words of the song instead of just taking music as if it's autonomous, which it isn't. Those kind of conversations are happening, but my very short-term hope is that those conversations continue to happen and become a really standard practice.
Yeah, it's about engaging and digging deeper instead of just kind of glossing over those histories. Thanks for sharing that, Alex. Would you like to tell us a bit about this world premiere that we're about to hear?
Yeah, of course. So this is a piece, just a 5-minute piece for solo piano that is brilliantly played by Aidan Chan, who is a fantastic, fantastic performer starting out at Royal College of Music, as I mentioned. And yeah, also, as I mentioned, this piece came out of a conversation that Aidan and I had. And it was, I guess, about a sense of not belonging. And we were talking about what happens when the only language you speak is the language that you don't trust anymore. So that might be, for me, as someone who doesn't speak Cantonese very well at all, what does it mean to try to question colonial context, but only to be able to speak English, which is like one of the ultimate tools of colonialism, arguably. Like, what does it mean for someone who's only trained in classical music to suddenly distrust all of the structures and pillars of classical music? So those are the kind of conversations we were having. And I guess the lack of, the feeling like you don't have the vocabulary to express what you want to express because the only thing you know is the thing that you've grown up in, that kind of thing. And so I guess this piece is a reflection of that, and it's quite, I guess, an explosive reflection of that. And I was imagining what the relationship is between the pianist and the piano, which for me is quite a very large symbol of Western classical music.
Beautiful. Really excited to listen. Yeah, let's listen to Knuckleduster, performed by Aidan Chan. Explosive indeed, and what an incredible performance by Aiden. Do we have any questions from Raymond or Rocky for Alex, and also from our audience?
Yes, oh my God, what a performance. That was really, really good. I could watch that another 3 times. So Alex, I guess it's not really a kind of question, but more like a comment that I kind of like observed from this piece and the piece from before, and I feel like as like you mentioned that you had the background like that basically what I was saying is during that piece I had like a feeling of the piano being an organ almost sound. Was that intentionally planned? Because that's very kind of the sonic of the piano almost sounds that big, and I was wondering if that kind of element was also blended into this contrast between the physicalities on these motions on the piano, and there's something that you always kind of carried. It was that in the plan, or was it just intuitively?
That's a good question. I guess maybe somewhere in between. I can't say that I ever thought of the instrument of the organ when I was planning or writing this piece, but definitely the physicality, which is maybe where the link is between the organ and the piano, just like that physical difference. And I guess in all of our pieces that we've seen today, the physicality, the physical element is such a important thing. But yeah, certainly I was thinking about the way that we can start thinking about the piano almost less of an instrument and more of an object, which I guess is why the kind of the tapping and the hitting was happening, and like just the crushing, that kind of thing, the thing which piano teachers always tell you never to do. So kind of, I guess, like unlearning ourselves was part of the exploration of the physical side of the instrument there.
Yeah, but the musical material though, in the like on the other hand, it has such strong, the scales going up, arpeggios, the modulations in different tonalities, and that's something very kind of like distorted classical piano repertoire almost. Was that kind of intentional as well?
That was absolutely intentional. Yeah, I guess I was imagining Aiden, like practicing your scales, practicing your arpeggios, because you have to do that 6-7 hours a day when you go to conservatoire. And then I guess across the piece, if he's practicing, but then we have these kind of clusters that keep coming back, which ultimately are just like dominating the scales. So it's like the person who's trying to practice just like, screw this, I can't be bothered to practice anymore, which is a familiar feeling that I have and had.
Sorry, I've got another quick question. It's just in your previous piece, I could see like that you were like having kind of mindful of the Chinese musical elements, in your previous piece, and I felt like for this piece, I can't really kind of see that you were trying to put any of like the musical traditional Chinese elements in it, and.
No, definitely not anything explicit. I think that for me, the link to Chinese identity with this piece is that Chinese identity isn't British identity and it's not Western identity. And so this piece was very much thinking about, destroying, vanquishing part of my own Western identity, which is why we have those like very kind of study-like passages with the scales and arpeggios, which do ultimately get destroyed.
Yeah, it's really cool.
But I can actually see the Chinese relationship in there is that piece actually remind me of some of the scenes that I used to witness when I go to the Tom Lee, which is the most famous piano shop.
Love Tom Lee.
And you can hear all the people bashing on the piano. That's how the feeling I have.
Raymond, that was me.
Me as well. But I love the fact that I think the three of us, our music is very, very different, but we approach that kind of Chinese identity, whether directly or indirectly, in so many different ways. But I think one of the things that really kind of, someone asked me before, they asked me what is my feeling or my opinion about it as a Chinese person, ethnically speaking. But you actually work in dominantly kind of Western musical tradition arena, that you write mainly for Western instrument. I mean, I went for Western instrument until like 10 years ago. I think I came to the conclusion is that my defense is that for me, instruments are just instruments. They became a canvas. It's almost like a painter. You learn to do really well in oil, or you do really well in watercolor. And then what is important is the way you use that mediums to express what you're trying to say. That is more important than whether it's just Chinese instrument or Western instrument or mixture of it. So it's almost like that. If we are mixing Chinese instrument and Western instrument, it's almost like a mixed media way of how I actually think to convince myself that what I'm doing. I think in a way that's how I justify it in a way. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. I actually think this is a great note for us to close on. And I know we have a couple remaining questions in the chat. So what I'm going to suggest is that we answer those on Twitter. So you can follow Tangram at Tangram Sound, TANGRAM Sound on Twitter and Instagram. We'll hop on there to answer those remaining questions. But I just wanted to say thank you again to Raymond Yiu, Sun Keting, and Alex Ho for joining in today with the Stay Connected program. And thank you to Chinese Arts Now for hosting us. It's so great to have a platform for us to have a conversation about these different ways in that we've walked into the music industry, how our cultural identity plays into that, but then also how much we don't know, how much unlearning is happening, how much discovery is happening. And I think that the ability to talk to each other while we explore our own artistic paths is such a gift. And of course, that the creative act is such a wonderful language for us to work out some of these questions. If anyone watching wants to see Tangram in action, I'd love to invite you to join us a week from today, Thursday, the 29th at 7 p.m. for the finale event in Chinese Arts Now's Stay Connected program, which is a Tangram Voices concert entitled Infusion, featuring our flautist Yixuan Chen, who you heard at the top in Corner of a Foreign Field. It's going to be really wonderful. Fabricio Matos, who played guitar, will also be there playing, and he directed this. We're excited to share this concert with you, so you can register via tangramsound.com. Hope to see you there and to keep this conversation going with all of you. And there's also a link in the chat as well, if that's helpful. That's all from us. 谢谢大家. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.